Okay, so section 4, necessity of a synthesis between the major and minor modes of access to techniques in the domain of education. The separation between the education of the adult and the education of the child in the area of technology corresponds to a difference in structure between the two normative systems, and to a certain extent, a difference between the results. As a consequence, a gap remains between pedagogical technology and encyclopedic technology that has yet to be bridged. Encyclopedic technological education aims at giving the adult the feeling that he is a fulfilled, entirely realized being, in full possession of his means and his forces, an image of the individual man in his state of real maturity. The necessary condition of this feeling is the universality of knowledge in theory and in practice. And yet within encyclopedic learning there remains something that is abstract and an irreducible lack of universality. The material combination of all technical devices within a technological volume that assembles and coordinates them according to an order of simultaneity or reason neglects the temporal, successive, quantic aspect of the discoveries that have led to the current state. One grasps all at once, and in actuality, what is progressively constructed, what is slowly and successively elaborated. The idea of progress, or rather what is mythical about it, comes from this illusion of simultaneity, which presents as a fixed state what is merely a stage. By excluding historicity, encyclopedism introduces man to the possession of a false entelechy, because this stage is still rich in virtuality. There is no determinism that presides over invention, and where progress is thought as being continuous, it masks the very reality of invention. The autodidact is tempted to bring everything back to the present, the past insofar as he assembles it within his present knowledge, and the future to the extent that he considers it as necessarily flowing in a continuous manner from the present through the intermediary of progress. What the autodidact lacks is having been raised in a progressive way, which is to say, having become an adult through a temporal series of developments that are structured by crises determining and enabling the passage to another phase. The historicity of technical coming into being must be grasped through the historicity of the subjects coming into being, so as to add the order of succession to the order of simultaneity, according to a form that is time. A genuine encyclopedism, which demands a temporal universality at the same time as a universality of simultaneity, must integrate the education of the child. It can only become truly universal if it makes an adult by means of the child, by following the temporal universality so as to obtain a universality of simultaneity. What must be discovered is the continuity between the two forms of universality. So he's beginning by setting up this contrast between pedagogical technology and encyclopedic technology. So he's first setting out this encyclopedic technology, and what it lacks is the sense of progress or temporal development in because it represents the state of technical knowledge in simultaneity, it doesn't grasp the temporal progress of the individual as a student or as a child learning about technical reality, and at the same time it doesn't represent the progressive development of technology through history. So would someone else like to read the next paragraph? No volunteers?
Sure, I can. Inversely, non-technological education lacks the universality of simultaneity. This is what is meant when one says that it sets its sights on culture rather than knowledge. But any enterprise that aims to obtain culture by ridding itself of knowledge would be illusory, because the encyclopedic order of knowledge is a part of culture. And yet, the encyclopedic order of knowledge can only be seen in an abstract and consequently non-cultural way, if it is seen outside of knowledge itself. A representation of knowledge without knowledge itself can only occur if it is grasped through an external symbol, as is the case, for instance, in the mythical and socialized representation of men who embody knowledge. Knowledge itself is then replaced by the figure of the scholar, which is to say, a cataloged element of social or characterological typology, which is totally inadequate to knowledge itself, and introduces a mystification into culture, making it inauthentic. At best, knowledge can be replaced by an opinion, a biography, a character trait, or a description of the personality of a scholar. But these are, once again, totally inadequate elements, because they do not introduce knowledge, but rather an idolatry of the human basis of knowledge, which is not of the order of knowledge itself. There is more authentic culture in the gesture of a child who reinvents a technical device than in a text where Chateaubriand describes the terrifying genius of Blaise Pascal. We are closer to invention when we seek to understand the cog-wheeled adding device used in Pascal's calculating machine, arithmetic machine, than when we read the most oratorical passages relating to Pascal's genius. To understand Pascal is to reconstruct a machine identical to his with one's own hands without copying it, even transposing it, where possible, to an electronic adding machine, so as to have to reinvent it by way of actualizing it, rather than reproducing Blaise's intellectual and operational schemas. To cultivate oneself is to actualize human schemas analogically, paying scant attention to the stir that this or that invention or publication caused among its contemporaries, which is inessential, or at the very least cannot be grasped other than with reference to an original thought, to invention itself.
Right, so he's introduced that contrast, and we saw the first side of the contrast, the encyclopedic technological education, and then now he's looking at the other side, the non-technological education, which instead of inculcating knowledge, it sets up this figure of the scholar as the one who has the knowledge, and then knowledge becomes an attribute of this other person rather than something that that we ourselves can possess. All right, I think that's fairly straightforward, so we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to read.
I can do some. Can y'all hear me?
Yep.
It is regrettable that a cultured people in the last year of secondary school knows Descartes' vortices only through Belize's simpering, and the state of astronomy in the 17th century through that great long frightful spyglass that Chrysale cannot stand. This indicates a lack of seriousness, a lack of truth in thought, which has no right to be presented as culture. Such evocations would have their place if they could be situated with respect to their real source, which would be grasped first, and not through the Phariseeism of a work of art that has other objectives besides culture. The encyclopedic order of simultaneity is expelled from cultural education because it does not conform to the opinions of social groups, which never contain a representation of the order of simultaneity, because all they represent is a minimal fraction of life in a determined epoch, and they cannot situate themselves on their own. This hiatus between contemporary life and culture comes from the alienation of culture, which is to say, from the fact that culture in reality is an initiation into the opinions of determinate social groups having existed in previous epochs. The primacy of literature and cultural education comes from this omnipotence of opinion. A work I can never say that word. In particular, a work that has survived is in fact a work that has expressed the ethics of a group or of an epoch wherein this group could recognize itself. A literary culture is thus enslaved to these groups. It is at the level of these groups of the past. A literary work is a social witness. The entire share of didactic works is eliminated from culture, unless it is ancient and can be considered as a witness to the didactic genre. Contemporary culture feigns to consider the didactic genre as something extinct, when perhaps never before has there been as much expressive force, as much art, as much human presence in scientific and technical writings. It is really culture that has now become a genre. With its fixed rules and norms, it has lost its sense of universality.
All right, so he's pointing, I think this is a sort of a specifically French sort of cultural education or form of culture that he's sort of referring to here, but it's the idea of a literary education. Someone being cultured means that they have an acquaintance with classical literary works, but that same culturedness or cultivation doesn't require any scientific or technical knowledge, and in fact it excludes this encyclopedic scientific and technical knowledge. So it integrates or initiates the student or the child into this social grouping through opinion, but it doesn't inculcate knowledge in the child. So it doesn't integrate them into this encyclopedic tradition of knowledge. Okay, I can read the next section. Therefore, education, in order for it to be fully educational, lacks human dynamisms. Considering in particular the technical aspect of this education and of encyclopedism, it is plain to see that it constitutes a mediator of great value, since it has aspects that make it accessible to the child and others that adequately symbolize the successive stages of scientific knowledge. The stumbling block that cultural education runs up against when it wants to become encyclopedic is the difficulty attached to wanting to understand this science merely on the basis of discursive intellectual symbols. Technical realization, on the contrary, provides the scientific knowledge that serves as its principle of functioning, in the form of a dynamic intuition that can even be apprehended by a young child, and which is susceptible to becoming more and more elucidated, doubled by a discursive form of comprehension. Truly discursive knowledge admits no degrees. It is either immediately perfect or false because it is inadequate. Through techniques, encyclopedism could thus find its place in the education of the child without requiring capacities for abstraction which the young child does not fully have at its disposal. In this sense, the child's acquisition of technical knowledge can initiate an intuitive encyclopedism, grasped through the nature, caractère, of the technical object. The technical object, in fact, distinguishes itself from the scientific object because the scientific object is an analytical object, which aims at analyzing a unique effect in all its most precise conditions and characteristics, whereas the technical object, far from being situated in its entirety within the context of a particular science, is in fact at a point of concurrence of a multitude of data and scientific effects, coming from the most varied domains, integrating what appear to be the most heteroclite forms of knowledge, savoir, and which can in some cases not be coordinated intellectually, while they are indeed coordinated practically in the functioning of the technical object. It has been said that the technical object is the result of the art of compromise. What is indeed an eminently synthetic structure, which cannot be understood in any other way than through the induction of a synthetic schematism that presides over invention. The technical schema, which is a relation between several structures and a complex operation taking place through these structures, is by its very nature encyclopedic, since it leads to a circularity of knowledge, a synergy of elements of knowledge that are still theoretically heterogeneous. So he's proposing the idea of technical education as a sort of intermediary that will introduce the child into scientific knowledge. So the child doesn't have the capacity for grasping abstract science or abstract schemas of thought that are used in science, but through technical learning, learning about technical reality, the child can learn scientific principles and be initiated into this encyclopedic knowledge because each technical object incorporates phenomena that have to do with different domains of science. It's not limited to one domain of science. So the technical sphere it serves as an intermediary and leads the child into the realm of scientific knowledge.
I think it's interesting the line that he designates the technical object from the scientific object as being the scientific object being analytical versus encyclopedic. I think this is very interesting. Has he referred to the scientific object before this in these terms? And I just have looked over it, or is this the first time that he's mentioned the scientific object?
I don't think he's explicitly sort of pointed to the scientific object, but there was a passage in the first section, or the first part, sorry, of the book, where he talks about how technical objects can be studied as scientific objects. Concrete technical objects can be studied as scientific objects because they incorporate a variety of different effects and yeah, so you can sort of set it up as an object of study in the same way that you would study a natural phenomenon. So I think this is the same, or sorry, a related idea here is that in scientific study, when you set up a scientific object, as you try to isolate it as much as possible and sort of reduce it to one particular sphere of reality. So you're studying, I don't know, magnetism, whatever it is. You want to isolate everything except for the magnetic effects in the object. Whereas in technical reality, all the different effects will be interacting with each other and going on at the same time, and contributing towards the overall functioning of the technical object. So that's the contrast that he's setting up here. Okay, so who would like to read the next paragraph?
I can go again. Perhaps it should be noted that until the 20th century, technics were incapable of assuming this relation between the encyclopedic work and the culture given to the child. For indeed, it was almost impossible at the time to find within technics truly universal operations, including the schematisms of sensation or of thought. Today, the existence of a technics of information gives technology an infinitely greater universality. Information theory places technology at the center of a large number of diverse sciences, such as physiology, logic, aesthetics, phonetic or grammatical study, and even the semantics of language, numerical calculus, geometry, the organization of groups and of regimes of authority, the calculus of probability, and all the techniques of transport of spoken, acoustic, or visual information. Information theory is an interscientific theory that enables the systematization of scientific concepts as such, the systematization of scientific concepts as much as the systematization of the schematisms of various techniques. Information theory mustn't be considered as a technics among technics. In reality, it is a thinking that acts as a mediator between the various techniques on the one hand, between the various sciences on the other, and finally between the sciences and techniques. It can play this role because there are relations between the sciences that are not only theoretical, but also instrumental and technical, each science being capable of making use of a certain number of other sciences for its own benefit, which it uses as technical sources in order to carry out the effect it studies. A technical relation takes place between the sciences. Technics, moreover, can be theorized in a scientific form. Information theory intervenes as a science of technics and as a technics of the sciences, determining a reciprocal state of these exchange functions. It is at this level, and at this level only, that encyclopedism and technical education can meet within a coherence of two simultaneous and successive orders of universality.
Right, so he's pointing here to the existence of information theory as this mediating field, so between different sciences with each other, between different spheres of technical reality with each other, and then also between science and technical reality together. And so this role of technics as and technical education that as initiating a child into encyclopedic knowledge or scientific knowledge that he pointed to in the last paragraph is only possible because of the development of information theory as this. So he says the techniques of science and the science of techniques. So it's this sort of double or mediating role between all the different spheres of technical and scientific knowledge that makes possible that form of education. And would someone else like to read the next paragraph?
Yeah, I can go for the next one. We can thus say that if to this day techniques could only provide two different to reconciled dynamisms, one of which is geared towards the adult and the other towards the child, with information theory, then this antagonism today gives way to a mediating discipline that establishes continuity between specialization and encyclopedism, between the education of the child and that of the adult. What is thereby founded is a reflexive technology above and beyond that different techniques, and what is thereby defined as a thinking that creates a relation between the science and techniques. Should I continue?
Yeah, I think so.
The consequence of this reflexive unification of techniques and the end of the opposition between theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge for the reflexive conception of man is considerable. Once this level has been taught, there is effectively no longer a hiatus or antagonism between the time of education and adulthood. In the order of succession and the order of simultaneity organize themselves in a relation of reciprocity, and adulthood is no longer antagonistic with respect to that of education. To a certain extent, even the evolution of society is stuck, up until now, on a determinism of youth, then of maturity, and finally of old age, along with the political and social regimes corresponding to each, can no longer be conceived as fatal if the penetration of techniques is deep enough to introduce a system of references and values that are independent of this implicit biologism.
Right. So he introduces this idea of reflexive technology. So again, remember that technology here means the study of technical realities, not the technical reality themselves itself. So this reflexive technology it's a technology that is a thinking of the relation between science and techniques. So this information theory is the sort of foundation of this reflexive technology, and it allows us to overcome this separation between theoretical and practical knowledge, and to sort of overcome this antagonism between childhood and adulthood, or the sphere in which you learn through this progressive introduction into knowledge, or initiation into culture on the one hand, and then the sphere of simultaneous encyclopedic knowledge on the other. So it overcomes that antagonism.
Hello. I'd like to make a small contribution here. I think I'm not entirely sure what he means by information theory, because earlier he used the word cybernetics, so I'm not sure whether we should understand something distinct from cybernetics proper or something closely involved with it. But anyway, I think pretty much around the same time, or at least 20 years later, Seymour Papert, he is working at the juncture between psychological development and computer science. So he's very attentive to children picking up on computer scientific themes. He also brought up this issue of a certain reconciliation between, let's say, concrete and a formal education. On the one hand, something that was previously particular to children's education, and on the other hand, something formal and what Simondon would call encyclopedic. So I find it interesting. I think what they share is a certain reference to the work of Jean Piaget, this developmental psychologist.
Right. Could you just put the names in the chat, just so for future reference, if someone wants to look up more information?
Sure.
Yeah, that's it's an interesting connection to make. I'm not sure. Yeah, I know Simondon does reference Piaget at some points, but I'm not sure whether or not he's pointing to that here, or just to the idea of pedagogy and development in general. It'd be interesting. I don't know Piaget's work very well, so it would be interesting to someone who knows him better to look at this section and see to what extent there's a sort of direct connection. Okay, I can read the last paragraph of the section. A careful analysis of the dualisms and value systems, such as those between the manual laborer and the intellectual, the peasant and the citizen, the child and the adult, would show that underneath these oppositions there is a technical reason for the incompatibility between several groups of schematisms. The manual laborer is the one who lives according to an intuitive schematism at the level of material things. The intellectual, on the contrary, is the one who has conceptualized the sensible qualities. He lives in accordance with an order that stabilizes the order of succession by way of definitions of nature and the destiny of man. He holds a certain power of conceptualizing and of valorizing or devaluing human gestures and values lived at the level of intuition. The manual laborer lives according to the order of simultaneity. He is an autodidact when he wants to gain access to a culture. It is according to the same difference between schematisms that the man of the countryside is opposed to the city dweller. The man of the countryside is contemporary with a set, ensemble, of requirements and participations that make him a being who is integrated into a natural system of existence. His tendencies and his intuitions are the links of this integration. The city dweller is an individual being, linked to a social coming into being rather than to a natural order. He is the opposite of the man of the countryside in the way that an abstract and cultivated being is the opposite of an integrated and uncultivated being. The city dweller is of a time, whereas the man of the countryside is of a place or region. The former integrates himself into the order of succession, the latter into the order of simultaneity. The attachment to traditions by the man of the countryside is generally what is noted, but tradition is precisely the most unconscious aspect of historicity, which masks the representations of the successive order, and which supposes an invariance of succession. Real traditionalism is based on the absence of a representation of the series of coming into being. This coming into being is repressed, enfoui. In the end, the opposition between the child and the adult summarizes these antagonisms. The child is the being of succession, made of virtualities, modifying himself in time and being aware of this modification and of this change. The adult, capable of facing the simultaneity of problems that life confronts him with because of his education, integrates himself into society according to the order of simultaneity. However, this maturity can only be fully achieved to the extent that society is stable and is not evolving too rapidly. Otherwise, society that is in the process of transforming itself, in privileging the order of succession, communicates a dynamism to its adult members that turns them into adolescents. So he's using the same opposition between simultaneity and succession here to characterize the city dweller and the country dweller. So the city dweller is sort of integrated into succession and what he calls coming into being. So changes in technology, changes in technical reality, changes in fashion, whatever, all the different things that are constantly changing in the city, whereas the country life is characterized as being static, or the changes are sort of repressed, and they are not made conscious. Yeah, so this is, I think we can question to what extent this is a valid characterization of the difference between country and city life. Whether city life is characterized by this succession, and whether the countryside is characterized by this traditionalism. I think that's something that's open to question, especially today. In the last 30, 50 years, when there's been huge movements of people from the countryside to the city, it's hard to make the same dichotomy as perhaps in 1958 or whenever he was writing this.
I really like the line, the manual laborer lives according to the order of simultaneity. He is an autodidact when he wants to gain access to a culture. I find that to be really interesting. And this whole paragraph is actually fascinating, and it makes me want to diagram it or something. See the urban versus rural distinction mapped between and the way that this could map to kind of educational categories as well is really interesting. I wish I knew more about the kind of transition of of education, and especially in France, excuse me, in the kind of, I guess the mid 20th century, there was a kind of there was I don't know what it's called, École Nouvelle or something like that, some kind of new school. Is that what it's called? I don't know. There's some kind of specific kind of history to this, especially in France, that I'm less than completely familiar with, but probably should be more so. I guess I just want to say that the whole countryside versus city kind of difference kind of reminds me of a lot of the Heideggerian kind of nationalistic kind of stuff with the kind of imagery of the rural sort of. And this is kind of a fascinating paragraph, kind of coming from just reading Heidegger related stuff as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up Heidegger because like in Heidegger, there's always the valorization of the peasant life or rural life and tradition and technology or technical reality is always sort of devalued. It's seen as something that is destructive of tradition and so on. Whereas for Simondon, he doesn't really seem to be setting up any sort of value hierarchy between these two modes of life. They both have their own set of values, their own reality, I guess you could say, and there's no basis outside of one or the other to prefer one over the other. All right, so that's the end of chapter 1. So part 2, chapter 1. So we can go on to chapter 2. I'm not sure how far we'll get, but we'll try to get through a couple sections. So I can start us off. Chapter 2, the regulative function of culture in the relation between man and the world of technical objects, current problems. Section 1, the different modalities of the notion of progress. The encyclopedist's attitude towards techniques can be considered an enthusiasm roused by the discovery of the technicity of the elements. Machines are not, in fact, directly considered automata by the encyclopedist. Rather, they are considered an assemblage of elementary devices. Diderot's collaborators directed their attention essentially to the organs of machines. In the 18th century, the technical ensemble was still at the scale of the cork cutter's workshop, or that of the scale makers. This ensemble links up with technical elements through the intermediary of the craftsman who uses tools or machine tools, rather than through the intermediary of veritable technical individuals. The division of subjects for study is consequently made according to rubrics of utilization and not according to schemas of techniques, i.e., according to types of machines. The principle in grouping and analyzing technical beings is the denomination of the trade rather than that of the machine. Very different trades, however, can make use of identical or almost identical tools. This principle of grouping thus leads to a certain superfluity of the presentation of tools and instruments, which, from one illustration to the next, can be closely related forms. So this is a theme that he's introduced earlier, the idea that in 18th century technical reality, the level of technicity was at the level of the elements, the technical elements. So tools, essentially, and it was the human being that served as the technical individual that handles the tools and uses them. And it's only in the 19th century that you begin to have machines which stand at the level of the technical individual. So the machines that operate tools and that replace the human craftsman or artisan.
So there's kind of two eras of encyclopedism. There's kind of like the Diderot encyclopedism, and then a kind of more recent encyclopedism. Is that a distinction he's making, or?
Yeah. Sorry, he actually and earlier in the last chapter, he made a distinction between three eras of encyclopedism. So yeah, there's the 18th century encyclopedia, and then there's I believe it was the later in the 19th century, and then he's pointing to a new era of encyclopedism developing at his time with the introduction of cybernetics. Yeah, so there's these three eras of encyclopedism that that integrate different levels of technical reality.
Oh, right. I guess Diderot's level would be the middle level, the Enlightenment era. Is that correct? Or is he's not the Renaissance era, the first encyclopedic era? I'm trying to figure out. I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right. It was the Renaissance was the first one, and then the 18th century was the second one, and it was only the third one is only developing in the 20th century.
Cool. Should I go on with the next paragraph, or does anyone else have any comments?
Yeah.
The principle of grouping according to technical ensembles comprised of an indefinite plurality of elements, however, is linked very closely to the idea of continuous progress, such as it existed for the encyclopedists. It is when technicity is grasped at the level of elements that technical evolution can occur according to a continuous line. There is a correlation between a molecular mode of the existence of technicity and a continuous pace of the evolution of technical objects. Gears and screw threads were cut better in the 18th century than in the 17th century. From this comparison between the same elements made in the 17th and in the 18th century arose the idea of the continuity of progress as a forward march in what we have called the concretization of technical objects. The evolution of this element, which takes place within already constituted technical ensembles, does not provoke any upheaval. It improves the results of fabrication without brutality and authorizes the craftsman to preserve habitual methods while experiencing the feeling of facilitation at work. The habitual gestures, better served by more precise instruments, now yield better results. The optimism of the 18th century is to a large extent based on the elementary and continuous improvement of the conditions of technical work. Anxiety effectively arises from those transformations that provoke a break within the rhythms of everyday life, making the old habitual gestures useless. But the improvement of the tool's technicity plays a euphoric role. When man, while preserving the fruit of his training, exchanges an old tool for a new tool, whose manipulation is the same, he has the feeling of having more precise, skillful, and rapid gestures. It is the entire corporeal schema that expands against his limitations, that dilates and frees itself. The impression of awkwardness diminishes. The trained man feels more skillful with a better tool. He has greater self-confidence, for the tool is an extension of the organ and is carried by the gesture.
Right. I think this is also a theme that he's developed earlier or alluded to earlier. The idea that technical development at the level of the elements is continuous. It's a constant improvement of whether it's screws or blades or gears or whatever it is. And this form of continuous development sort of underlies the ideology of progress and optimism that characterizes the 18th century understanding of technology. So yeah, there's this continuous evolution of the technical reality, and it's creates or accompanies this optimism of an ideology of progress. Okay, would someone else like to read the next paragraph?
Sure, I can go again. The 18th century was the pivotal moment for the development of tools and instruments. If by tool, one understands the technical object enabling one to prolong and arm the body in order to accomplish a gesture, and by instrument, the technical object that enables one to prolong and adapt the body in order to achieve better perception. The instrument is a tool of perception. Some technical objects are both tools and instruments, but they can be called tools or instruments according to the predominance of their active function or of their perceptive function. A hammer is a tool, even though through the receptors of kinesthetic and vibratory tactile sensitivity, we can subtly perceive the instant when the nail starts to writhe or to split the wood and penetrate it too fast. The hammer must effectively act on the tip so as to drive it in, so that according to the manner in which this operation of driving in the tip is executed, definite information is communicated to the senses of the one who holds the hammer in his hand. The hammer is thus first a tool, since it is a result of its tool function that it can serve as an instrument. Even when the hammer is used as a pure instrument, it is still primarily a tool. The mason recognizes the quality of a stone with his hammer, but for this to happen, the hammer must first partially chip away at the stone. Conversely, a telescope or a microscope are instruments, in the same manner as a level or a sextant are. These objects serve to collect information without accomplishing any prior action on the world. And the 18th century is the age in which both tools and instruments were made with greater care, reaping the rewards of 17th century discoveries within static and dynamic mechanics, as well as those found in geometrical and physical optics. The undeniable progress of the sciences was translated into the progress of technical elements. This accord between scientific investigation and technical consequences is a new reason for optimism that adds itself to the content of the notion of progress. Through the spectacle of this synergy and this fecundity of the domains of human activity, the instruments improved by the sciences are at the service of scientific investigation.
Right. So here he introduces this distinction between, or he explains this distinction between tools and instruments, but it's not that important for the rest of the development, I don't think. But the idea is that there's a second basis for the ideology of progress and optimism, in that not only is there this continuous development of the elements, of technical elements, but also you have the impact of scientific research onto technical development in the production of better tools and instruments, which in turn is applied to scientific research again in a sort of virtuous circle. Okay, I'll go on to the next paragraph. The aspect of technical evolution changes, on the contrary, when the birth of complete technical individuals is encountered in the 19th century. As long as these individuals merely replace animals, the perturbation is not a frustration. The steam engine replaces the horse and hauling wagons. It drives the spinning mill. Gestures are modified to a certain extent, but man is not replaced insofar as the machine simply provides a greater utilization of energy sources. The encyclopedists were familiar with the windmill, which they magnified and represented as dominating the landscape from the height of its tall, silent structure. Several extremely detailed illustrations are dedicated to new and improved watermills. Man's frustration starts with the machine that replaces man, with the automatic weaving loom, with the forging press, with the equipment of the new factories. What the worker destroys during a riot are the machines, because they are his rivals. The machine is no longer simply an engine, but a bearer of tools. 18th century progress left the human being intact because the human individual remained a technical individual among his tools, of which he was both the center and bearer. It is not necessarily through its size that the factory distinguishes itself from the craftsman's workshop, but through the change in relation between the technical object and the human being. The factory is a technical ensemble that is comprised of automatic machines, whose activity is parallel to that of human activity. The factory uses true technical individuals, whereas in the workshop, it is man who lends his individuality to the accomplishment of technical actions. From then on, the most positive, most direct aspect of the first notion of progress is no longer experienced, éprouvé. The progress of the 18th century is a progress experienced by an individual through the force, speed, and precision of his gestures. The progress of the 19th century can no longer be experienced by the individual, because it is no longer centralized with the individual as the center of command and perception in the adapted action. The individual becomes the mere spectator of the results of the functioning of the machines, or the one who is responsible for the organization of technical ensembles, putting the machines to work. This is why the notion of progress splits in two, becomes aggressive, ambivalent, and a source of anxiety. Progress is at a remove from man and no longer makes sense for the individual, because the conditions of the individual's intuitive perception of progress no longer exist. This implicit judgment, which is very close to that of kinesthetic impressions and to the facilitation of a corporeal dynamism, which formed the basis of the notion of progress in the 18th century, disappears, except within domains of activity in which the progress of the sciences and of techniques provides, as in the 18th century, an extension and facilitation of individual conditions of action and observation, as is the case with medicine and surgery.
I'm sometimes obliged to teach a kind of intro to technology studies or a kind of sociology of technology, and I'm struck by this material that it's very phenomenological and sort of genealogical at the same time. It's kind of like we kind of bat around this word, this concept of technological determinism. And here, I think he's really kind of cracking open the history of that in this very succinct way that it's very appealing to me.
Yeah, I definitely think that that pull between determinacy and technological progress too is kind of interesting. It's kind of this. I don't have any really extended comment, but I also think this is really interesting kind of pedagogical route when we're talking about technologies, the kind of evolution of technology. It's interesting. That was like a completely absent comment of any information. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. It's good. I mean, I guess the point is that, like, for me, it's become quite ahistorical to just say, to basically introduce students to the concept of progress by way of this concept of technological determinism. And it's been emptied of a lot of its sort of concrete historical content. And moreover, it's been emptied out of this specifically technical dynamic, right? So it just, for me, it puts me in mind to like be more, after reading these passages, I'm definitely going to be more sensitive about it the next time I talk about it, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting he doesn't sort of explicitly lay out a theory here, but he's I guess presupposing an idea of the way the ideological sphere is determined by this lived experience of technology. So the difference between the 18th and the 19th century ideologies of the technical is brought about by the difference between the lived experience of of technical reality in the 18th and the 19th century. So it'd be interesting to sort of draw that out a little bit more than he does here.
Yeah, to do so, especially in the context of information theory, like the way that, internet technologies and digital technologies, network technologies, because they are so reliant upon information theory at the sort of guts of how they function as technical elements, and then how we gain a sense of feeling progressive in the context of that specific, both the encyclopedism and the concrete experience of technical elements. I think that's like, you could get a lot out of sort of, like you're saying, sort of extrapolate from this context into the 21st century would be, I think, fruitful.
Yeah, if someone wants to write that paper, I'd be very interested to read it.
I tried to look at some stuff on information theory, and the mathematics is beyond my ability to work with, unfortunately. But it's definitely the kind of the science of computing technologies. It's like information theory, so it's been very predominant in the 20th century, of course. And I guess, isn't information theory characterized a lot by signal receptivity?
Yeah, the sort of classic information theory has to do with analyzing the probability that underlies the possibility of receiving messages. So, in order to send a message with a certain quantity of information, you have to have a signal that is capable of distinguishing, that much information. So, like if you're sending the result of a coin flip, you have to have a signal that can distinguish two different states that can be received at the other end. Right, and then the more different possible states you want to be able to transmit, then the more capacity you have to have in the signal in order to be able to transmit them. And that's the sort of simple explanation of the idea of information theory. But obviously, it's much more detailed and developed than that.
One thing I did want to ask about was about the splitting of progress into and a kind of like a psychology of progress in which, depending on your perceived position in relation to it, it kind of creates an offset such that there is the individual who has like been moved past by the feigned progress of technology versus, I guess, in the previous era of technological psychology. I guess could say that there was a sense of like imminentness that there was with the progress of technology, that technical progress, because it was this continuous evolution of technical elements, contained a kind of optimism, which was a kind of universalism, which kind of makes sense with the Enlightenment era, I suppose.
Yeah, so the earlier ideology of progress, the 18th century ideology of progress, it relies on this sort of unified continuous development, whereas in the 19th century, because we no longer have that continuous development, we have instead this split of the notion of progress, where progress becomes something on the one hand, it's considered in developing the wealth of the nation and so on, but then on the other hand, it's putting people out of work, and it's perceived as a threat. So there's these two aspects of progress that are both experienced at the same time by different people.
It seems like there's a theory of kind of a progressive mass psychology of technical objects that kind of is embedded into his theory of the evolution of technical objects here, which is I didn't really see this coming. He's always full of surprises. He puts more and more and more into this all the time. The idea of like the optimism of the continuity and the kind of moving past that optimism kind of shows a whole psychodynamic kind of progression on top of the world of technical objects. It's just kind of interesting. But anyway, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but they're probably going to be clarified in the next paragraphs. So, oh yeah, and one more thing. What do you think about medicine and surgery, which, because it sticks close to like individual conditions, kind of subverts the double-edged sword of progress for the 18th century, for the post is it it's the technological, the cybernetic, the post Enlightenment that has this splitting of progress in two, right? But what is it with medicine and surgery that is somewhat of an exception to this, and why? I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah, as I understand it, it's because medicine and surgery, in medicine and surgery, the human individual is not replaced by a machine. In the 19th century, you don't have surgical machines or something like that replacing surgeons. You instead you have the progress. What progress there is, it takes the form of perfection of elements. Better scalpels, better. So the introduction of the germ theory of disease leads to better hygiene in medical practice, things like that. So you have this sort of incremental development, which makes medical professionals, doctors and surgeons have this awareness of progress, or this feeling of progress, this feeling of more increasing capability, rather than having this idea of this double-sided idea of progress that appears in the realm of industrial technology.
I wonder if this can be generalized as if the optimism of the continuity related to this the evolution of the elements being kind of individualized per technician or per craftsman. I wonder if actually, I think my sentence is getting away from me here, but I wonder if this can be kind of generalized, I suppose, to kind of whether it is the case that life sciences, or life techniques are the sense of optimism is extended beyond what would otherwise be the case with industrial technologies, like as a kind of general rule of historical progression, or if this is just kind of an accident of the particular evolution of medical technology in this period.
Yeah, I think I understand. I would suggest that this is not a more general principle or thesis. So, for what I'm thinking of as an example is genetically modified organisms have this similar type of dual apprehension, I guess you could say, or take up. You have on the one hand, they're presented as they're going to solve world hunger. It's going to produce all this great agricultural progress and so on. And then on the other hand, you have all sorts of, going to extremes. You have conspiracy theories about genetically modified organisms, but then there are also people that have whose livelihoods are being displaced by genetically modified organisms. So it has that same type of dual two-faced development as industrial machinery had in the 19th century.
So it could be that that today techniques of life or techniques of medicine and health, the techniques of health have become this kind of double-sided progress which are anxiety provoking to some, rather than being just optimistic. Like they had maintained their kind of oasis of optimism where into the 18th to 19th centuries, I suppose, when the more industrial techniques had lost that optimism.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is something, and maybe we could tie in as well, like anti-vax, conspiracy theories as the other side of progress in medicine. And a lot of these developments that we see in the last 50 or so years of medicine, life sciences, health, and things like that have all been sort of taken up into ideology in this double-sided way, where you have on the one hand this progress ideology, and then the other side this threat ideology. So I think it's right to say that the same type of process as happened with industrial technology in the 19th century has been going on for life sciences and medicine in the late 20th and early 21st century. So would someone like to read the next paragraph? I think we can go on.
I can read some more, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Progress is henceforth thought of as cosmic, at the level of its overall results. It is thought abstractly, intellectually, in a doctrinal manner. Progress is no longer thought by craftsmen, but by mathematicians who conceive of progress as man taking possession of nature. Beginning with the Simonians, this idea of progress starts to support technocratism. An idea of progress that was conceived and desired substitutes itself for the impression of progress as something undergone. Éprouvé. The individual who thinks progress is not the same individual as the one who works, except in some rather rare cases, such as the case of the printer and lithographer, who have mostly remained craftsmen. Even in these cases, for those who think deeply about its nature, the advent of the machine is expressive of an aspiration for the transformation of social structures. One could say that work and technicity were linked in the 18th century through the experience, éprouvé, of elementary progress. Conversely, the 20th century brings about the disjunction of the conditions for the intellection of progress and for the experience of the internal rhythms of work resulting from the same progress. 19th century man does not experience progress as a worker, he experiences it as an engineer or a user. In fact, the engineer, the man of the machine, becomes the organizer of the ensemble made up of workers and machines. Progress is grasped as a movement that manifests itself through its results, rather than as progress in itself understood as the ensemble of operations that constitute it, as the elements that actualize it, and as being valid for a large number of people that would be coextensive with humanity.
Right. So this is the one side of the two aspects of progress in the 19th century. So the one side is the engineer, developing this ideology of technocracy or of progress through the sort of rationalization of society and the integration of or the development of industrialism and integration of society into the industrial age or industrial mode of life.
I think it's interesting that he chose to use the English original term for engineer, and I wonder how much the discourse of engineering is a kind of Anglophonic discourse, or why he chose to use English to refer to the engineer.
Yeah, I think the role of the engineer is a little bit different in France compared to England, where in France you have these big state schools like École des Mines. So engineers or the profession of the engineer is more integrated into sort of public works, things like bridges and roads and mines and things like that. Whereas in England, you have more the factory level engineer or railway engineer or something like that. The engineer as a private individual. So I think that might be what he's pointing to here is that the engineer, the type of engineer that he's thinking of is the engineer who is working in an industrial, private environment rather than for state public works.
Earlier, he used the word human engineering in a different sense than what we are used to, I guess.
Right. Where was that? Where he used the word or the phrase human engineering?
I think it was about 2 sections before this one, as far as I remember. I'll try to find it.
Right. Yeah, I don't remember that specifically, but I think the term human engineering is a 20th century term, so it wouldn't have existed at the time that he's writing about here. But he points in this section or in this paragraph, he points to the way that the sort of engineering ideology incorporates the human being into the industrial process. So the engineer doesn't just design better machines, but incorporates humans into the process in a better way. Oh, Xiao has added the page number in the chat here, so it's page 117 if anyone wants to look that up. Right, used as an original English term. Right. Yeah. So and it's tied to cybernetics. So I think it's a term that's newly introduced at the time that he's writing in the 50s.
It seems to be that this difference between this engineering sense of progress is its kind of teleological limitations, that it's results oriented at the expense of other characteristics. Is that a good super succinct summation of at least the last part of the paragraph?
Yeah, I think why he's characterizing as results oriented is because this engineering ideology points to progress as so many tons of coal produced or tons of iron or yards of linen or whatever it is. It's just technical progress means producing more and more goods and expanding the wealth of society. But the actual organization of the production process itself is not really considered in that idea of progress. So the fact that you have 9-year-old children working 15-hour days or whatever it is to produce all these wonderful goods is not really considered as like an aspect of this progress. So I think that's what he's pointing to when he talks about it being results oriented.
And what sacrificed is, I guess, probably it seems like most keyed in on when he talks about the rhythms of work, I think is what's sacrificed here, right? By this kind of results orientation.
Yeah. So whereas in a artisanal production or craftsman production, the worker has control of the work process. They they control the pace of work and moving from one task to another, and they have a sort of overall picture of the work process and integrate all the different elements at the level of an individual human being. In an industrial production, you have the worker is subordinated to the machine, to the rhythm of the machine. So the worker does one repetitive task over and over again at whatever pace the machine is set at, which is controlled by the factory owner and not by the worker. So the rhythm and the gestures and again, the worker has no knowledge of the overall process of production. They only know the one limited task that they have to perform repetitively. So all of that is with all of the control that the artisanal worker had over the process is lost in the industrial process. I think we can go on to the next paragraph if someone would like to read.
I can go again. Indeed, the poets of the end of the first half of the 19th century keenly felt progress to be the general march of humanity, with its charge of risk and anxiety. With this progress, there is something of an immense collective adventure, of a voyage, and even of a migration toward another world. This progress contains at once something triumphant and crepuscular. It is perhaps the world that Vigny sees written above the cities in La Maison du Berger, the shepherd's house. The feeling of ambivalence toward the machine can be found in the evocation of the locomotive and the compass, the former La Maison du Berger, the latter in La Bouteille à la mer, the bottle in the sea. The latter poem shows how Vigny felt about the transient and perhaps transitory, because contradictory, nature of progress in the 19th century. This unfinished, incomplete idea of progress contains a message for posterity. It cannot fulfill itself within itself. One of the aspects of Les Destinies, is to accept living within this moment of technical evolution. Vigny made it accurate and significant by understanding that technical evolution could not satisfy itself by way of itself, that it couldn't simply close in on itself.
So this ideology of progress it has a sort of home, you could say, with the engineer, but then it's also reflected in poetry here. So Xiao has put in the chat here the question, what does satisfaction mentioned here entail? Let's see, satisfaction. Do you mean in the last sentence here, where it's the idea of accept living within the moment of technical evolution? Is that what you're pointing to? Oh yeah, right. The last bit. Technical evolution could not satisfy itself by way of itself. It couldn't simply close in on itself. Yeah, that's a little bit obscure to me. I think what he's pointing to here is the idea that technical progress is, as he points out a little bit earlier, it's something transitory. So there's maybe what this is pointing to is you have a number of economists at this time, like Ricardo, thought that, and even Adam Smith a little bit earlier, they thought that technical progress and economic growth was a temporary phenomenon. Whereas today economists tend to think of growth as just like the natural state of the economy and something that can continue forever. somehow. Adam Smith and Ricardo thought of growth as something that was a temporary phenomenon, and that eventually fairly soon there would be an end to growth and technical development. So I think maybe something like this is what he's pointing to: the idea that technical progress is a temporary phenomenon. Like, in the early 19th century, we're living in this era of technical progress that won't last very long, and so we can sort of celebrate it and live through it now, but it's not a permanent state of the world.
Is there something going on maybe around a kind of distinction between means and ends, in the sense that like technical evolution can produce a kind of, it can fold back in on itself and constantly kind of hone and refine the means of accomplishing things, but that society needs to somehow sit outside of that in order to sort of define social goals and sort of have a kind of ethos for society that somehow sits outside of technique? Like, I just think there's other sort of instrumental theories of technology that sort of pitch things in that way. I realize that's maybe not historically accurate, but I get a sense that that's sort of what's also going on here.
Yeah, that's possible. That's what he's pointing to as well. The idea that technical progress is not an end in itself. It needs some sort of end, that for which progress is done or performed. So, if we're trying to improve life, then we need to have an idea of what it is to have a good life and how we're getting closer to that. So that it could be that he's pointing to that, I guess, incompleteness or unsatisfactoriness of technical progress in itself. Okay, so I can read the next paragraph. A third aspect of the notion of technical progress emerges with the repercussions of the internal regulation of technical individuals regarding technical ensembles, and through these regarding humanity. The second stage, that which corresponds to the arrival of a new wave of techniques at the level of individuals, was characterized by the ambivalence of progress, by the dual situation of man with regard to the machine, and by the production of alienation. This alienation, grasped by Marxism as having its root in the relation of the worker with the means of production, does not only derive, in our view, from a relation of property or non-property between worker and the instruments of work. Beneath this juridical and economic relation exists an even more profound relation, that of the continuity between the human individual and the technical individual, or of the discontinuity between these two beings. The reason why alienation arises is not solely because in the 19th century the human individual who works is no longer the owner of his means of production, whereas in the 18th century the craftsman was the owner of his instruments of production and of his tools. Alienation does indeed emerge the moment the worker is no longer the owner of his means of production, but it does not emerge solely because of this rupture in the link of property. It also emerges outside of all collective relation to the means of production, at the physiological and psychological level of the individual, properly speaking. The alienation of man in relation to the machine does not only have a socioeconomic sense, it also has a physio-psychological sense. The machine no longer prolongs the corporeal schema, neither for the workers nor for those who possess the machines. Bankers, whose social role has been exalted by mathematicians such as the Saint-Simonians and Auguste Comte, are as alienated in their relation to the machine as the members of the proletariat. What we mean by this is that there is no need to presuppose a master-slave dialectic in order to account for the existence of alienation within the proprietor class. The relation of property with respect to the machine contains as much alienation as the relation of non-property, even if it corresponds to a very different social state. On either side of the machine, above and below, the worker, who is a man of elements, and the industrial boss, who is a man of ensembles, both lack a true relation with the individualized technical object in the form of the machine. Labor and capital are two modes of being, where one is as incomplete as the other with respect to the technical object and the technicity contained in industrial organization. Their apparent symmetry does not at all mean that the union of capital and of labor reduces alienation. The alienation of capital is not alienation with respect to labor, with respect to the contact with the world, as in the master-slave dialectic, but rather with respect to the technical object. The same goes for labor. What labor lacks is not what capital possesses, and what capital lacks is not what labor possesses. Labor possesses the intelligence of elements, capital possesses the intelligence of ensembles, but it is not by combining the intelligence of elements with the intelligence of ensembles that one can arrive at the intelligence of the intermediary and non-mixed being, that is the technical individual. Element, individual, and ensemble follow each other along a temporal line. The man of the element is late with respect to the individual. but the man of ensembles who has not understood the individual is in no way ahead of his time with respect to it. He tries to enclose the present technical individual in the structure of an ensemble belonging to the past. Labor and capital are both late with respect to the technical individual that is a depository of technicity. The technical individual is not of the same era as the labor that enacts it and the capital that frames it. Yeah, so there's I think there's a lot in this paragraph. So he brings up the master-slave dialectic that he points to here. This is a chapter in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and it was sort of reappropriated by a lot of 20th century French philosophers as a sort of basis for like a Hegelian Marxism or something like that. He's rejecting this this model of the relationship between capital and labor, and he's introducing this third term, the individual, the technical individual, as being the intermediary but not mixed being. So it's not a mix between labor and capital. It's a level of reality that is not grasped by either labor or capital. The laborer is at the level of the elements, and capital is at the level of the ensemble. And then there's this level of the individual, which is not grasped by either side.
So is this a critique of Marxism, or a comment on alienation in relation to the master-slave dialectic? Or maybe I've been trying to wrap my head around this paragraph and how this functions. Is it a critique of Hegel, of Marxism? Is it a kind of integration of Marxist theory in some respects in regards to alienation? Like, how do you think this paragraph works within the the various positions of? Because I mean, it seems to be that if the alienation of capital is not in respect to labor, but with respect to the technical object, that this could be seen as like subversive towards like some Marxist arguments, right? So I'm wondering if how y'all would characterize the relation of this perspective on technical objects and capital in relation to the tradition of Marxism.
Yeah, I think there's I guess you could say like multiple layers of sort of what's going on in this paragraph. So on the one, sort of maybe the first layer is he's criticizing this Hegelian Marxism, or this appropriation of the master-slave dialectic as a model for the relationship between the proletariat and capital. So if you take up this model, then you would have the idea that the proletariat is alienated from technical reality because it lacks possession or this overall knowledge of the technical reality, and then capital is alienated from technical reality because it doesn't have this immediate contact with it the way the laborer does. So he's rejecting that model. So he rejects this master-slave model of this relation. But I think he's also he wants to incorporate something from Marxism beyond this model. So the idea that this idea of alienation, the way that technical reality as something human, created by human beings, is experienced as something alien, is something outside of human reality. He wants to incorporate that idea. But then it's ultimately, I think, maybe like the third level. I think it is a criticism of Marxism itself, rather than just this Hegelian form of Marxism using the master-slave dialectic. So by introducing this third level of technical reality, the technical individual, as something that is lacking to both aspects, to both sides of the labor and capital conflict. It's introducing something. So his argument here is that Marxism lacks this third element, or doesn't grasp this third element, and so it's a criticism of Marxism as such, and not just this Hegelian form of Marxism.
It is interesting that that the master-slave dialectic, that is kind of a way to a logic of desire and work, where the desire of the master for the product produced by the slave is what's the important aspect, as well as the kind of life or death implications of the relation. So but there's this particular kind of like craftsman and crafting and consumption relation that is kind of that is important for the doctrine of recognition, I guess, in the phenomenology of spirit in Hegel's master-slave dialectic. So this makes sense with his previous writings, that the kind of the artisan mode of production has kind of ceded towards a technical mode. So it kind of fits in with his previous remarks, I guess, on this subject, that this would be that it's no longer just this logic of production and consumption, but something which the technical object has a certain alienation which supersedes just this kind of like lack of like the endless work, the alienation of endless work, for instance, of the slave to the master.
I think you can, another way you can pick up that thread, I think that's great. The way you can pick up the thread is to say that Marx was very much focused on de-skilling in the context of mechanization. And I think that this, material like this or ideas like this really complicate that, to sort of say it's, both the capitalist and the worker understand that, are led to understand the individual as an economic unit, right? Like whether it's an embodied gesture that can be done more efficiently, or a commodity that comes out the other end, there's a kind of process of individualization going on there that covers over, or as an economic relation that obscures or covers over a technical relation, which is much more about kind of how a body fits together with a machine in terms of like thinking about design or something like that, right? And so Simondon allows you to sort of push past a kind of narrative about de-skilling and be able to start to say more complicated things about where domination asserts itself in the overall kind of technical ensemble.
Yeah, I think actually Charles Sanders Peirce's critiques of Hegel's perspective on progress or evolution can be kind of prescient here when it comes to technical evolution, because he introduces like a three categories of evolution, and criticizes Hegel as being kind of stuck at the second, where the first is a purely fortuitous relation of evolution. The second is a mechanical kind of process of evolution. And the third is what he calls evolutionary love, or agapeistic. And I've been trying to kind of piece together from Simondon these kind of psychological incentives that would call for something transcending a kind of mechanical evolutionary perspective. And it's interesting to kind of think about that in coordination with this very kind of direct critique of Hegel here by Simondon.
I'd be interested to know where Peirce talks about that, just as a matter of a bibliographic reference. And I guess the other thing I would say is that, like, I think you may find answers to your questions in if and when we turn attention to the new stuff, the form of information and light, or light and form of information and individuation, or whatever it is, the sort of his more sort of psychosocial account of I don't know, of society or whatever, and I assume in relation to technology in certain significant ways.
The name of the Peirce article is called "Evolutionary Love," so it's easy to remember. It's a good one too.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, I think it's also probably worth mentioning that some of the aspects that Simondon is pointing to here in his criticism of Marxism are actually, I think, contained in Marx's works already, but they weren't sort of highlighted, I guess, until later, until like the second half of the 20th century. So I'm thinking of Marx introduced this distinction between what he calls formal subsumption and real subsumption. So in the historical development of capitalism, you have the formal subsumption of the worker under capital. So the worker, this is primarily in housework in, I guess, the late 18th century. So you had workers in their own homes spinning cotton or whatever. They were sort of brought under capital, where you had a putter out, a capitalist who would give the workers raw cotton, and then the workers would spin it, and then the putter out would buy it back from them or pay them for the work they've done. But in the early stages, the capitalist has no direct control over the production process. So it's only at the level of finances or of legal property that the capitalist controls the whole process. And the workers work in their own homes and on their own time and so on. And it's only later on, later in the 18th century or beginning of the 19th century, that the capitalist brings about real subsumption, where the capitalist has control of the production process itself by bringing the workers into a centralized workshop rather than working in their own homes. They work in the capitalist workshop, and then the capitalist controls the production process itself. So I think this distinction is something like what Simondon was pointing to here, at the level of the technical individual. It's what Marx is talking about is not just the juridical property, as Simondon says here, but also the control of the production process itself. And this is an aspect that, in the late 19th and early 20th century, the first maybe 75 years of Marxism was not really taken up very much. And then it's only in the last half of the 20th century that you begin to have labor process theory and study of the conflicts over the control of the labor process within the Marxist tradition.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hope to at some point become more up to date with contemporary perspectives on Marxism, which I've informed have become much more coherent and organized since like the 1980s.
Yeah, there's been new documents that have been published, different unpublished works by Marx, some that were edited after his death in ways that can be questioned, that have been republished and so on. So there's been more. There's material that is available today that wouldn't have been available when Simondon was writing this. Marxism, of course, is a tradition, a living tradition that develops through time rather than just a static sort of doctrine. So there's been theoretical development since Simondon's time as well that he obviously didn't have available to him.
Although I think a lot of the especially for the French studiers of Marx in the early 20th century, the 1844 manuscripts, I believe, was a big thing that changed perspectives on Marxism in relation to his criticisms of Hegel, and specifically in relation to alienation, which became much more coordinated towards Hegel's conception because of what Marx had written in the 1844 manuscripts. This is what I've heard from studying the early 20th century Marxists.
Yeah, that's right. The 1844 manuscripts were only published in, I want to say, 1920s, and yeah, they have a much more Hegelian or Feuerbachian sort of theoretical orientation compared to the later stuff, and the concept of alienation plays a much bigger role as well. So you had a sort of tradition that took up those 1844 manuscripts in Germany and France, especially, and sort of, I guess, brought about this idea of a sort of humanist Marxism, Marxism that would be centered around the idea of alienation and human reality, of reincorporating the alienated aspects of existence into human reality. So I think that might be the sort of background that he's thinking about here, and that tradition would not have really looked at the labor process and at the level of the technical individual. So that's I think why he's pointing to that as something missing from Marxism, is because he has that tradition in mind.
Sorry, just a question. In this paragraph, there's the going beyond corporeal schema part is quite clear, and it's also pretty fair when he was extending beyond the point about socioeconomic relations and talking about the alienation having so much to do with the physio-psychological sense. And it's pretty straightforward when I think about the worker's perspective on that, but I do have a little bit of challenge thinking about how does the alienation from the perspective of physio-psychological that applies to the industrial boss or the other side of the worker. Like, how did you guys comprehend that? What is it for the industrial boss side when it comes to the physio-psychological aspect?
Is this like what is important for the kind of equation of capital when it comes to not the worker, but how does the technical object relate to the manager, or not, rather than the worker, or I guess the boss? I don't know if there's a technical term for the boss. There probably is.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a technical term for the boss per se. I mean, I comprehended it a lot, based on the term of corporeal schema per se. Again, sort of caught in the thought about agency, where it's not quite a bit about just ownership of instrument or the means of production, but more even to the relation of human with machine, where it's no longer a bodily extension for the worker, but where the worker has become a accessory of sorts. And I was kind of comprehending the physio-psychological sense of alienation he was mentioning from that end on the human is kind of like a merely accessory at some point, but I don't know how to reframe the question as what is that version of alienation? What is that version of physio-psychological alienation for the owner or for the capital ensemble organizer, industrial boss person?
Right. I think this is incredibly interesting here, because without the kind of implicit psychology of of desire in relation to the production goals that cannot be, like nothing is good enough kind of aspect of it, which is kind of is really a big part of the kind of Hegelian and the early 20th century Marxist / Hegelian kind of perspective on alienation. Without that that aspect, how do we kind of envision the role of the master in the technical process, or in relation of the technical object with the craftsman? Or is this kind of is this category eliminated, or Is it maintained? In what regards do we still have like the psychology of desire as playing a role in the technical object and the evolution of the technical object and capital? I guess if you want to throw that in there.
Yeah, I think what he's pointing to, so this is right at the bottom of 133, where he points to the physiological and psychological level, or alienation in the physio-psychological sense. I think what he's pointing to here is that the owner or the manager is not at the level of the technical individual who is actually performing the work, compared to the craftsman of the pre-industrial era. So the technical reality is not doesn't have that same sort of immediate corporeal reality that it did in the 18th century. So even though the capitalist or the manager has control over the technical production process and dominates the process, they don't have they aren't integrated into it in the same way that the craftsman of the 18th century was. And in this immediate corporeal way, they have an abstract intellectual representation of the technical process and of the ensemble that they organize, but they don't have a corporeal grasp of the technical process.
Right. I mean, I also wonder if it's a matter of sovereignty. Like I don't know what's a better word for it, but the earlier form of techniques a lot of the time are very geographic specific. Like you have ceramics at an area where the soil actually fits to have clay that you can do so, or like metalworks having to, like somewhere that produces copper metalwork have to have like a mine nearby. But like this is the only case that I can bring it into reality and think about it, where even the owner would, even if the owner has derived out of someone as a craftsman and have more knowledge, understanding, and economical means, that by this stage of the alienation, a business can no longer be self-contained, or maybe more commonly not geographically specific, where like everything is a lot more dependent. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably another aspect of what he's pointing to here, because we saw earlier when he's discussing this transition from the technical individual to the technical ensemble. He pointed to the way that in the sort of thermodynamic stage of industrialism, you have this integration into railway networks and this sort of broader scale of technical development. So it's not just one isolated factory that produces nails or whatever it is. It's the factory is integrated into a network of railways that connect mines and ship ports and shipping facilities, and it's this worldwide network of production and distribution that the factory is integrated into. So the capitalist is the organizes production in relation to that worldwide network, but they don't have but that organization is carried out at the level of like an intellectual process, a representation of the market conditions and the transportation facilities and logistics and so on, rather than a corporeal grasp of the production process, which the owner might not even know anything about. They might not really know how production is carried out. They don't really need to know. They just have to organize the network in which production is integrated.
Yeah, that's very fair. That reminds me of like an extreme example of, I know there's a plastic injection molding company in Canada that had an early patent for Yeah, pretty much like plastic injection molding, pipes, and things like that. And their equipment is so specific to the point that North America does not produce the type of lubrication they need. So one time they had a delay on a certain lubricant that they needed for a batch of work. And so I think they paid like $50,000 for someone to go get the lubricants in Asia and then have someone drive it specifically to an airport, human guarded by another person, and having this bottle of lubricant transported within 24 hours from the point of ordering.
Yeah, so that's like when you compare an artisanal production process where everything is all integrated in one workshop, and the craftsman has mastery over every aspect of the technique. When you compare that to this factory that relies on lubrication from halfway around the world, and has to do this sort of elaborate sort of mission to retrieve this lubricant in an emergency. It's a completely different way of organizing the production process.
Yeah, on that note, like, who looks forward to 5G?
I'm ambivalent. I have more bandwidth than I need.
I'm genuinely so scared of a hacker hacking agricultural facilities and then the world fall into a hunger.
Oh, I wouldn't worry about it. People are pretty security obsessed these days, so there's probably a lot of redundant systems that are designed to kind of prevent that type of thing. I mean, I'm just imagining this, but I hope there are.
I mean, after Toyota, like, didn't even improve their electrical brake system and have so many people accidentally died just because the gamma ray has hit their system, or like same things happening in planes where they have met gamma rays just randomly traveling through Earth, hitting the control system as well, and having it dropping 2,000 feet, and also meeting like completely, I don't know, not quite detail-oriented people writing manuals for planes. Yeah, hard to know how to feel when even agricultural and tractors and irrigation systems and everything will be controlled via internet instead of Ethernet.
Yeah, there's some like scary stuff when you start looking into some of the details of how infrastructure is managed, and like you have like a I don't know, like a dam operation or whatever is it'll be connected to the internet, and it'll be like hard coded. The password will be hard coded into the machine, so it's not even possible to change it. And like if anyone, hackers can get access to that password, they'll be able to control a dam remotely over the internet. And there's been a few instances of apparent cyber attacks on infrastructure, just because infrastructure tends to not have the type of security that like an office computer would have or something like that. Like it tends to be very basic type of security, and then if it's connected to the internet, it makes it very vulnerable. So having all of our sort of daily activities and infrastructure and everything all integrated into the internet just makes it all that much more vulnerable. Actually, I'm going to post a book in the chat in just a second.
While we do that, should I read the last bit here because to the end of the section?
Yeah, we're just about at time, so go ahead.
The dialogue between capital and labor is false because it is of the past. The collectivization of the means of production cannot achieve a reduction of alienation on its own. It can only achieve this reduction if it is the precondition for the acquisition of the intelligence of the individuated technical object by the human individual. This relation between the human individual and the technical individual is the most difficult to form. It presupposes a technical culture, which introduces the capacity of different attitudes rather than that of work and of action. Work corresponding to the intelligence of the elements, and action to the intelligence of ensembles. What work and action have in common is the predominance of finality over causality. In both cases, the effort is directed at a certain result to be obtained. The employment of means finds itself in the position of minority with respect to the result. The schema of action matters less than the result of the action. In the technical individual, however, this disequilibrium between causality and finality disappears. Viewed from the outside, the machine is made in order to obtain a certain result. But the more the technical being becomes individualized, the more this external finality effaces itself for the benefit of the internal coherence of functioning. The functioning is finalized with respect to itself before being so in its relation with the external world. Such is the automatism of the machine, and such is its self-regulation. There is at the level of regulations of functioning, and not only a causality or finality. In self-regulated functioning, all causality has a sense of finality, and all finality a sense of causality. I'd say this is kind of talking about the or bringing to center the conjunction of cause and effect into a unity of a machine, right? In a sense that there's a kind of presupposed kind of way that we talk about cause as we think of it as a proximal cause, such that we find the most exact immediate cause for something, and we disregard finality as a kind of causal relation. The kind of thing we think about like ultimate purpose or ends of something. We tend to separate from questions of cause and effect because we think of cause and effect as itself mechanical in a certain kind of syllogistic way, that you just have one cause, one effect, like a stimulus response mechanism. But there's this long tradition of thinking of finality and causality in the same breath, going back to the final causes of Aristotle, for instance, and the talk of teleology, which Simondon references quite a lot in these sections. So it's comfortable for him to kind of put it really nice and close together with finality and causality here, and talk about the mediator here being the technical individual, if I'm correct, right?
Yeah, I think he's also pointing to what we saw in the first part of the concretization of the individual. So when a technical individual becomes concrete, its functioning is integrated in such a way that it's not just sort of a bundle of components that each has a certain finality to it. Instead, they're all the different components, all of their processes are integrated into a self-regulating functioning, so that rather than having a technical object that is produced for the sake of a certain end external to the technical object, instead you have a technical object that that functions to maintain itself. It's a self-regulating technical object. So that's, I think, what he's pointing to here as well. Okay, so it sounds like we've sort of exhausted the content of this section for now. So I'm going to just shut off the recording, and we'll pick up at section 2 next time.
Oh, and if y'all haven't already been informed, the recordings are going up on YouTube in the Simondon reading group YouTube page, which is new and fun to listen to. If you miss a session, it will be uploaded hopefully in short time if I can get it going quickly enough. So hopefully this session will be posted soon as well, and I am definitely personally going to review over it and meditate a little bit on some of these themes, which are always a little bit more complex than I think they're going to be.
Yeah, and thanks again, 61, for editing the recordings. If you could post a link to the YouTube channel in the channel here, that would be great. And I'm just going to shut off the recording. So See everyone next week.